Go to the misshapen tree of Umbra. In that forsaken place, blood must spill. The blood of your fellows. The Erd-Tree faithful.
Before we begin the video, here's a mandatory spoiler alert. This video is a no-holds-barred discussion of a focal aspect of the DLC's narrative, so if you haven't beaten the DLC yet, you should do that and come back to this video afterwards. 3 weeks later, and we've only begun to scratch the surface of Shadow of the Erd-Tree. Each playthrough opens the curtains slightly more, letting in just so much light that we're slowly, but surely, beginning to see the real narrative form take shape. In this video, we're going to explore the possible answers to a question that hasn't yet been answered by anyone to my knowledge. What is the Scadutree? In doing so, we're going to uncover layers upon layers of secrets which help us to understand the nature of the Land of Shadow itself. This will recontextualize everything we thought we knew about the lands between Marika, the Crucible, and the Age of the Erd-Tree. The Scadutree is a brutal symbol of oppression, death, abandonment, hatred, and betrayal. Ironically, given that it's titled in the DLC, we don't really know anything about the nature of the Scadutree at first glance. To my knowledge, no NPCs even mention the Scadutree by name. I wish they did, so we could all agree on a pronunciation. Then again, we can't forget the Amygdala debacle.
Oh, Amygdala! Oh, Amygdala!
We know so little about these lands that the Linguistic Inspiration project undertaken by You the Red Scholar, which is linked in the description below, still has thick, blank spaces for where the names of cities of the DLC might correspond to real-world or mythological places. For example, above and below Bellurat on the list is Bale and Bonnie, both from the DLC, both of which have nice, full descriptions. Bellurat, on the other hand, is completely blank. Enir-Ilim is blank too. So, what is the relationship between the Scadutree and the Erd-Tree? Which came first, and how can we know? How are we supposed to understand its falling sap, its twisted branches, and its brittle trunk? The Scadutree is the predecessor to the Erd-Tree, both spiritually and physically. A once perfect spiral that reached to the heavens, the Scadutree is the great tree of legend. Now, it's crooked and slumped as its vitality has been plundered by the Erd-Tree since the beginning of Marika's oath with the Greater Will. We can surmise that Marika brought the Erd-Tree to fruition after being guided by her two fingers to the Finger Ruins to collect the seed. Evidence for this is found in the +1 variant of the Crimson Seed Talisman. Its item description states, the Erd-Tree seed of this talisman was presumed to be an object of myth. This age-old artifact also depicts the two fingers, perhaps harking back to the birth of the Erd-Tree. This is a reference to the Empyrean Marika's two fingers, which Count Emir suggests were unsound from the start. As we'll see, the Scadutree far predates the two fingers and the mythical seed of the Erd-Tree, and thusly its birth. The Scadutree is the hardly standing, withered monument to the Age of the Crucible, supplanted by the Age of the Erd-Tree. It looms mysteriously over the Land of Shadow, inviting us to question its place in the world of the DLC in much the same way that the Erd-Tree did in the base game. Like the Erd-Tree, we can see it from every possible vantage point. Unlike the Erd-Tree though, very few items mention it by name. It isn't venerated. It doesn't foster minor Scadutrees as there are no Shadow Seeds, nor, as I mentioned, do any NPCs explicitly refer to it by name.
Only the smoldering flame in the great forge of the giants on the highest peak in the lands between can burn the Erd-Tree.
There are only a few items that aren't directly a part of the Scadutree, like its fragments, which mention it at all. For example, the Mantle of Thorns item description, which reads, the image of the misshapen Scadutree is an edict. Spurn all that exists. Wound all that exists. For we have been abandoned. Likewise, the Impenetrable Thorns incantation item description tells us, the image of the twisted Scadutree is an edict. Denounce their ways. Do them harm, for they have abandoned us. These item descriptions only point us in certain directions without providing any concrete answers as to who they're addressing. The other item which directly refers to the Scadutree is the Remembrance of the Shadow Sunflower. Its item description states, Remembrance of the Scadutree avatar, hewn into the Scadutree. The Scadutree is the shadow of the Erd-Tree. born of dark notions that bear no sense of order, that twist and bend its stalk, rendering it brittle. By born, we'll see that it doesn't mean comes to be. Quite the opposite. The birth of the shadow is the death of greatness. To understand the Scadutree, we'll first need to uncover the secrets of the Land of Shadow, tilling the very soil into which the Scadutree digs its roots. At first, the truths of the Land of Shadow are incredibly elusive. There are ghastly gravestones, new enemies, giant wicker men, nameless mausoleums, and so much more assault our senses until we finally give in and allow ourselves to be immersed in the land. My first crossing of the Graveside Plains felt very, very new. Every sight was completely novel. But what if it wasn't? What if we'd seen the Land of Shadow before? What if the Land of Shadow was shown to us from the very beginning? In the opening cinematic of the base game, we're shown an image of the Land of Shadow. Coffins are surrounded by the bodies of uncountably many tarnished, being watched over by a shadowy figure. This figure's waving a thurible, an incense holder used by Catholic priests during different rites of worship. How do we know this is a scene in the Land of Shadow? Because of the particular statue of Marika looming over the ritual reincarnation of the Tarnished. The statues of Marika in the Land of Shadow are markedly distinct from the statues of Marika in the Lands Between. In the Lands Between, Marika is always depicted in her signature pose of crucifixion. Likewise, she always has her iconic hairstyle, one long braid, one cut braid, split in the back. Even her armbands are distinct. The first of these statues that most players will find is in the Church of Consolation, decapitated and guarded by a Black Knight, surrounded by seated soldiers of Messmer, who are completely passive. Even engaging with the Black Knight will not convince them to attack you. The Church of Consolation goes hand in hand with the item description of the Black Knight set. The Black Knight armor description tells us that it's armor worn by the Black Knights, servants of Messmer the Impaler. Though the engraving above the heart is a Scadutree design, it's etched in gold. A small consolation to those forced to wage a war without grace or honor. We can extrapolate from this item description that the imagery of the Scadutree is not often bound up in gold. This is because gold stands at odds with shadow. Gold can't actually represent shadow in this world. This imagery is like an attempt at drawing a dark room with a light pen. As you trace the room, it loses its darkness. So too, when one traces the Scadutree with gold, it comes to represent light. It comes to represent the Erdtree. And these Black Knights are Erdtree faithful. I take this as a sign that these knights are bound to the Land of Shadow forever, but are still considered to be fighting for gold, for Marika, even if they, themselves, are no longer capable of being touched by grace. The Church of Consolation is also where many of us found our first Scadutree fragments. Consuming these items raises your Scadutree blessing, scaling up your damage output and defense while in the realm of shadow. The Scadutree fragment item description reads, a splinter of the Scadutree that contains golden brilliance, acquired at the Church of Marika and other places in the realm of shadow. It's said that when the Scadutree crumbles from its core, that it'll scatter across the entire realm of shadow. The people of the Erdtree collect the splinters and use them in prayer. The fragments of the Scadutree are not venerated by the people of the Land of Shadow. The Hornsent don't use the splinters in prayer. The people of the Erdtree do. Why would the people of the Erdtree collect the splinters of the Scadutree and use them in their prayer? Especially if shadow is meant to stand in opposition to gold. Clearly, they don't find the Scadutree sacred in itself. They're venerating the crumbling of the Scadutree at its core, and what that crumbling represents. The breaking and battering of the Land of Shadow in a very fundamental way. For all of the secrets of the Scadutree that are locked away behind nuance and investigation, what we do know is that the Scadutree stands tall over the Land of Shadow, dumping its resin near its base, spawning the Scadutree avatars. And we know that the Scadutree was not always gnarled in its currently twisted form, given the incredibly old reliefs we find of it in a prehistoric, perfect spiral throughout Enir-Ilim. A picture has begun to emerge of the Land of Shadow and, more specifically, the Scadutree. The cultures which currently inhabit the Land of Shadow do not venerate the Scadutree, but some cultures did at some point. This isn't mere speculation. Before Marika's people founded Shaman Village, before the Hornsent were blessed with horns by their close proximity to the Crucible's current, and before the Scadutree was wounded, bent at the middle and spilling its sap at its base, there was an ancient, technologically advanced culture which saw the Scadutree for what it really was, the Great Tree. The tree whose spiral shape reached up to the sky in the Land of Shadow was the same Great Tree whose roots reached across the Lands Between. The Great Tree whose roots still reach into the catacombs in the Lands Between, soaking up the viscera of warriors and leaving behind root and knot resin. Root resin's item description states, resin secreted from the roots of the Great Tree can also be found near trees on the surface. The roots of the Great Tree were once linked to those of the Erd Tree, or so they say, and it's for this reason catacombs are built around Great Tree roots. I offer a novel reading of this item description here. The roots of the Great Tree are no longer linked to those of the Erd Tree because there's no longer an Erd Tree, not because of the fading away of the Great Tree, or Scadutree. The Scadutree, falling slowly away to a whisper, still stands, unlike the burned, ghostly Erd Tree. In contrast, the knot resin item description tells us that it's a knot-shaped lump of resin that exuded from the roots of trees, found near tree roots everywhere in the realm of shadow. Serves as a primitive catalyst, making it suitable for processing using sorceries, incantations, and the like. I love this item description, as it helps to show the ways in which the Scadutree is linked to a combination of intelligence and faith. This is seen in spells such as Spira Tower Sorcery. The Spira Sorcery's item description reads, Superior Sorcery of the Tower Priests, wielded as an incantation of the Spiral. The Spiral is a normalized crucible current that one day will form a column that stretches to the gods. This item description uses key terms which help us to understand the crucible better, such as normalized, a social term, meant to signal to us that these sorceries, wielded by current occupants as incantations, hinged on their faith in the crucible as the norm. This is just to say that it's normal to participate in the crucible here. I believe that normalized crucible current is just a sociological way of saying a society which understands and participates in the nature of the crucible, and the column that stretches to the gods is, of course, Enir-Ilim. On the other hand, it cannot be understated that the culture who founded these sorceries would have wielded them as sorceries. This is to say that Spira would have been cast as a matter of intelligence. Perhaps Spira and other sorceries of the tower play a role in the building and floating of Enir-Ilim by its original inhabitants. Let's come back to the resins for a moment. If you look closely, there's more than simple sap making up these resins. These resins are sap mixed with the viscera of bodies found at the roots of their respective trees. In the Lands Between, Erd Tree burial rebirths people again and again as themselves. No one dies true or destined deaths. In the Land of Shadow, however, when people die, they also get absorbed by the roots of the Great Tree. They simply fail to be rebirthed as themselves. They die true, destined deaths, and, as it says on the Ancestral Spirit's Horn, thus does new life grow from death, and from death one obtains power. Regardless of the mechanics of Erd Tree burial and rebirth, there's a problematic biome condition for the Great Tree, as the Erd Tree has co-opted the root system for itself, as we learned from the root resin item description. The Erd Tree bypassed the Scadutree systems for nourishment in favor of its own, sponging the bodies and spirits of the fallen in the Land of Shadow and the Lands Between, sapping their spirits and slowly emaciating what was once a great and perfect spiraled tree. The Great Tree inspired the indigenous inhabitants of this land to construct Enir-Ilim, a spiral city reaching up towards the gods. And then, at the top, they would build a gate, the Gate of Divinity, in order to bridge the gap between the world and the cosmos, connecting with outer gods. I argue here that the contemporary Lands Between should be seen more as the land of the gods than as another simple realm of humanity separated from the Land of Shadow. The Lands Between, after all, is the fantasy realm of this world. It contains actual gods and demigods, dragons, sorceries of every type and kind, sprawling giants and titans whose skulls make up the literal geography of the world, and the list goes on. In comparison, the Land of Shadow is actually quite tame, and quite human. I've come to see the Land of Shadow as something akin to Midgard in Norse mythology, where the Lands Between are like Asgard, realm of the Aesir. The Erd Tree stands as Yggdrasil, usurping the middle trunk. The Scadutree, demoting its status as great, as it's no longer nourished by the natural cycles of its bygone eras. The age of the Crucible, after all, is over. Or is it? I believe that Marika's banishing her omened children to the sewers is evidence that the Crucible is alive and well, and she remains afraid of its retribution. In order to better plot the historical narrative of the Land of Shadow, which allows us to understand the current Lands Between as more of a land of gods, we need to take a close look at the site of Marika's betrayal, Enir-Ilim. Its architecture, its art, and the many layers of the Gate of Divinity tell a story that the Falling Leaves could never. Enir-Ilim is a place of wonder. My first time through, I was positive that the tower was built by, well, the people of the tower. I figured it was built by the Hornsent, as it was inhabited by all manner of horned persons, from the Empyrean Grandam, to the Inquisitors, to the divine beast, bird, and horned warriors found throughout. They just seemed to fit so nicely into the area, aesthetically and otherwise. But this couldn't be further from how this city, which was built with the purposes of reaching towards heaven, came to be. Like we saw in the base game with the old ruins, later being inhabited by the Nox, and Mogwyn Dynasty Palace, inhabited by Mohg's Dynasty of Blood, Enir-Ilim experiences something of a Constantinian shift. There are at least 3 different dynasties that inhabit this city in the sky over the course of its existence. Firstly, we have the ancient civilization, whose third-personal repose reliefs keep the fourth wall intact. We can see these reliefs on the outskirts of the architecture. We can also see them on the door to the Divine Beast Dancing Lion's boss room, and in different sections above doorways. This culture venerated the symbol of the spiral in itself, for itself, setting the precedent for the spiral imagery worship that would be co-opted by cultures who would come after them in different forms. A closer inspection reveals that there's a standalone statue that's been superimposed in front of the reposed reliefs. Once you see one, you see more, and more, and more of the standalone statues, either in front of reliefs or as reliefs themselves, carved out of much, much younger stone. This was likely a result of removing the old reliefs and replacing them with imagery of their own warriors, priests, statesmen, and so on. At some point in the history of Enir-Ilim, a second dynasty moved in. The oldest style of the reliefs in Enir-Ilim very closely match those found in the ruins of Shofra and Old, although the content is noticeably different. There are, of course, reliefs with trees and Shofra River and the like, and they do look similar to the Scadutree relief tablets, but without the spiral base. Likewise, they clearly aren't of the Erdtree. The only other place that we see this particular relief is in the Land of Shadow. This relief is found on the Suppressing Tower, where it tells us we're standing in the very center of the Lands Between. All manner of death wash up here, only to be suppressed. The Land of Shadow isn't a pocket dimension. It's simply veiled out of sight by Marika. I'll discuss Marika's powers of veiling in another video. Enir-Ilim is literally overloaded with evidence of the different cultures which inhabited it in different eras. It also offers us a picture of the city which is only ever inhabited by one culture at a time. This is because, as we'll see, each culture meets a gruesome end before the next finds the occasion to move in and worship the Great Tree in its interpretation of the symbolic spiral. If we travel to the side of Enir-Ilim adjacent to the ruins of Rao, we get a bit more environmental storytelling that I missed on my first few times through the DLC. Looking at Enir-Ilim from the burnt ceiling tree, the wall of Enir-Ilim is, itself, charred. My original thought was that it had been charred by the burning of the ceiling tree. This isn't so. The walls were charred, and the oldest reliefs were charred, but we can see that the newer statues which are placed in front of the charred wall are not. They're not perfect, they're still old, but they're definitely not burnt. So, the ancient peoples who invented the superior tower sorceries would be the first to inhabit the tower. Then, a second culture comes, perhaps those who would come to call themselves the Nox, judging by the contribution of their very specific, upside-down architectural prowess to the spiral city of the gods. The 2 eldest cultures of Enir-Ilim have something very, very important in common. Neither of them are horned. Each of these ancient cultures also worshipped a particular representation of the Scadutree, a perfectly symmetrical, spiraling tree which brought forth an abundance of normalized crucible energy from the core of its helix. What's more, they worshipped the symbol of the spiral in similar but different ways, one building spiral columns, and the other adorning those columns with carved imagery of rope and reliefs going up the sides. The culture that would come to the tower later, the Hornsent, would worship these spirals in imperfect ways, adding statues made of readily available but oxidizing materials, such as granite, that the rest of the city simply isn't made of. It's worth noting here that there's only one kind of unique relief of a horned humanoid anywhere in Enir-Ilim. This relief is found on a myriad of tablets, not on a wall, near a tablet carving of the Scadutree before it was malformed by Marika's betrayal and the grafting of the Erdtree to its roots. This tablet, combined with the other horned, non-humanoid statues with crumbling bases, leads me to believe that everything horn-related in Enir-Ilim was built out of softer materials by the Hornsent after they moved in. They're meant to look older, but really, they're just poorer quality materials. Softer stones. All of the horned statues found around are chipping at the edges, fading more quickly than the others, or, in the case of the humanoid statues wrapped in horns, oxidizing quickly. None of the other statues or pieces of the city are showing signs of either phenomenon. While there's much more to say about the two elder cultures who constructed and inhabited Enir-Ilim, such as the fact that they obviously built the nameless mausoleums before their exodus, it's enough to state here that the Hornsent are clearly not the indigenous inhabitants of the Spiral City in the sky. While the Hornsent may not have much in common with the other cultures in terms of archaeology and sculpting, they do share a particular occurrence with them. Masses of their people are found charred throughout Enir-Ilim, hanging from buildings, branching off from pillars, and so on. A similar tragedy struck this city across 3 very distant epochs of its denizens. In order to make heads or tails of the burned bodies throughout the tower, we need to make our way all the way to the top of Enir-Ilim, to the most illuminating piece of history as regards the Land of Shadow, the Gate of Divinity. Similarly to the archaeological layers found across Enir-Ilim, there are idiosyncratic layers of bodies which depict at least 3 times that the Divine Gate has been used. Each use saw a gruesome tragedy left behind in its wake. Each layer of compacted, burned bodies on the gate tells a story. What stories they tell, however, must be mostly speculation. So I'm going to offer my most plausible explanation here as to what the Divine Gate is actually for. Bargaining with the outer gods for the power to conquest in the lands between. This speculation comes in part from what we know the Divine Gate isn't. For example, we know that it isn't the device that one would use to move to the lands between from the Land of Shadow, or vice versa. The coffin ships, for example, arrived from outside the Land of Shadow before it was sealed away by Marika. We also know that the roots of the Great Tree from the Age of the Crucible were physically connected to the Erdtree, even after the veiling of the Land of Shadow. Moreover, Miquella doesn't use the Divine Gate to come to the Land of Shadow, but specifically to ascend to godhood. He's already in the Land of Shadow, shedding his being and leaving crosses for us to find. Likewise, Radahn is already in the Land of Shadow, having been killed by us during the festival as part of the requirements for entering the DLC. Radahn doesn't enter the arena through the gateway. Lastly, if we didn't already know, the Suppressing Pillar's self-statement of location gives us a clear indication that, at one point, this was the Lands Between. If the Divine Gate isn't used for the purposes of traveling between the lands, what does it do? I argue that, before the veiling of the Land of Shadow and before Marika's conquest with Godfrey, residents of this land would have stayed relatively close to Enir-Ilim, as the rest of the Lands Between was extremely dangerous. For the ancient cultures, traversing to, say, the mountaintops of the giants with their fell god was all but certain death. To travel to Caelid, one would need to contend with the Titans. The other humans who lived outside of this area were nomads of a sort, such as the astrologers on the mountaintops, who saw the fire giants as neighbors, and who ultimately became the different conspectuses of Raya Lucaria and Liurnia. And of course, to the south, in Limgrave, the Storm Lord would still have been the monarch of Stormvale, as he had not yet been conquered. Every direction held greater and greater foes. These are the civilizations who were warred against by Marika and Godfrey after her ascent to godhood. Most importantly, though, the Great Tree, the bastion of civilization for these early cultures, was here. This is where they built their city in the sky. This is where they would make their pacts with the gods. The users of the gate plea with the outer gods for power of a kind by offering them a sacrifice at the gate. The outer gods reached might accept the plea for power in order to extend their own reach in the actual world. If the bargain was agreed upon, those peoples would be able to spread out into the rest of the Lands Between and conquest with their newfound power. Early on, when we ask Needle Knight Leda of the Hornsent, she points us in this explanatory direction, telling us that man is by nature a creature of conquest. If this is true, then being trapped, unable to conquest, is to be in an unnatural state. In short, the primordial land of shadow was itself a crucible for the gods, a land used by the outer gods to forge the representatives of their respective ages out of civilizations that would vie for power. Any civilization with aspirations for conquest against the harsh cultural elements of the greater lands between would move through these lands, reach Enir-Ilim, study the gate, and if they could muster the strength and following for a proper sacrifice of the appropriate level, they could summon and bargain with an outer god for the power to conquest. Some would go on to build the old palace, and others would go on to build the eternal cities. Of course, as the story always goes, said power would corrupt that culture, leading to its inevitable downfall and the disappearance of its people. This also helps to explain why it is that certain cultures cling to some imagery before their ascension, and afterwards tend to alter that imagery. They have something akin to eldritch knowledge of the new truths of their age. They can abandon their false idols at Enir-Ilim in exchange for the imagery of their new gods. They can abandon the Great Tree for the Dark Moon or the Formless Mother. But, in most cases, the Great Tree continues to stand tall as a perfect representation of a normalized Crucible current. Before Marika's ascent to godhood, the Age of the Crucible is still the monolithic one against the backdrop of warring minor gods, outer though they may be. It isn't until the Greater Will sends his gleaming star, Metyr, with the Elden beast on her back that the monolithic power of the Crucible is truly challenged. Let's look closely at the gate. I argue here that the Divine Gate is a Yorishiro, or an object capable of housing spirits, giving them a physical space to occupy. The purpose of Yorishiro is to be a kind of antenna or lightning rod to attract the gods. While oftentimes Yorishiro are natural objects, like trees, they're also often man-made in more contemporary versions. The Great Tree, plus the Gate, would have been something like the concurrent versions of these. What's more, persons can play the role of Yorishiro, and are called Yorimashi, or possessed persons. So, the gate is playing the role of the lightning rod to attract the gods to a physical space, and the consort to the god would act as the one who would be possessed by the spirit. This is why we see Miquella around Radahn's back in the DLC, or why the Elden Beast needs to be housed inside both the Elden Ring and Marika and Radagon. The gate itself is made out of densely compacted bodies and some kind of mortar. The most fundamental level of bodies is almost calcified and fossilized. These skeletons are what's left of the first civilization's use of the gate. Like the wind blowing through the gate when Marika is beckoned by the Greater Will, I can imagine that whatever outer god was contacted unleashed a furious flame, burning those who were pressed to the gate in sacrifice to open it. We can see that their expressions are captured from the moment that they were burned. Importantly, none of the skeletons in the base layer of the gate have horns. They all have a particular, unique look to them. This layer has thick ropes embedded into the gate. After doing some research, these strike me as Shimenawa, or enclosing ropes. The purpose of the enclosing rope is to ward off evil spirits, oftentimes with the hopes of drawing in the spirit that one desires to be there. The next layer up from the compacted bodies in the fundamental layer are also burned to a crisp, but they have depth and dimension, and are hardened, clinging to the wall in agony. They're also burned and hardened in an instant, but they aren't calcified in the same way. And more than just their skeletons are frozen in time, their whole bodies are petrified by whatever bargaining took place at the gate this time. The final layer brings us to the culture of speculation, the Hornsent. We don't get flash-frozen bodies with horns on them until this third layer. What's more, this layer is particularly unique in that there are Hornsent who are not yet attached to the gates, arms outstretched, as if to say, "Wait for me," at the moment this occurred. These bodies are a clue as to the betrayal and abandonment spoken of by the Hornsent throughout the game. Walking around the arena shows us that we can walk over and through any of the hornless bodies melted into the ground without any collision. The moment we walk over a horned body, though, it's instantly destroyed. Whatever method burnt the Hornsent, it didn't create flash-frozen bodies with the same hardness as the others. There is one item from the DLC that helps to solidify my view that the Gate of Divinity is for interacting with the Outer Gods, the Outer God Talisman. The item description reads, "A talisman engraved with the lore of an Outer God. Raises arcane. The clan, who lost everything in the Great Fires, peered upon the corpse of their ancestor, normally an act of sanctity, and saw in its shadow a twisted deity. The clan had suffered such torment that the horrible thing was taken as an object of worship." Who was the clan, and who was their ancestor? The corpse which they peered at? Why did the act, which was normally one of sanctity, show itself as one of profanity? I'm looking forward to speculation from the community on this one. If you have any ideas, drop it in the comments below. I think it must be deeper than the clan being the Hornsent, and the fires being those of Messmer. The talisman is presented in a much more antiquated way, found in a church built by the first dynasty of Enir-Ilim, but surrounded by statues of the second. Now that we have a full picture of the many cultures of the Spiral City in the sky, and their views of the Scadutree, let's come full circle. We have to ask, why does the Great Tree fall to shadow and become brittle with the bargaining of Marika after having stood through the test of at least 2 other uses of the gate? Why does the Land of Shadow have a Scadutree instead of a Great Tree? I want to leave a warning here. Most of what follows in the conclusion of this video is pure speculation. As someone who's thirsting for a cohesive answer to the open questions we currently have about the base game and the DLC, about the journey of Marika to godhood, the Gloam-Eyed Queen, and so much more, I offer here my current, most cohesive version of the events that are alluded to by the story trailer when Lita mentions seduction and betrayal. In my view, the difference between Marika's use of the Divine Gate and the previous uses is that she would not only abandon the Great Tree as a false idol like the others, but, in her pact with the Greater Will, she would graft the Erd Tree to the Great Tree's roots, usurping its status as Great Tree of the land. The Crucible's status as a monolithic current would also be challenged by Marika and the Greater Will. Marika would deem the Crucible blasphemous, discarding her own spiral imagery, such as her headband and belt as we see them on her statues in the Land of Shadow, replacing it with imagery of gold. Likewise, her wild hair would be tamed into braids by the Greater Will, literally. We can actually see this happen in the story trailer. The moment the gust of wind passes Marika as she removes the golden thread from the godskin adjacent being, a frame-by-frame slowdown shows Marika's hair being braided in real time. The meaning of braids in the lands really helps to contextualize this occurrence, as well as the idea that what happens at the Divine Gate is, indeed, a pact with an outer god. For example, the braided cord robe item description says that it's a ragged black cloth overlaid with braided cord, attire of a vengeance-seeking Hornsent. The braided cord ties together the vow of the Revenger with the victim's grudges. It must never come undone. I discussed the Hornsent of Bonnie Village in depth in a previous video, but suffice it to say that Hornsent, the NPC who wears the braided cord robe, takes an oath to exact his revenge on the Erd Tree faithful, by acknowledging the betrayal leading to the suffering of his kin, and the grudges that they hold. The braiding of Marika's hair by the blast generated due to her stepping up to the Gate of Divinity represents the oath that she swears to the Greater Will to protect the Erd Tree to be from those who would threaten it, making sure that it grows tall and strong in the lands between, spreading the influence of grace to an untold number of lives. It follows that her cutting of the braid in Shaman Village represents a breaking of that oath, deciding to move antagonistically to the desires of her 2 fingers, ultimately landing her in the position that we find her at in the end of the game, crucified, impaled, broken, petrified, and alone. I wonder whether Ranni wore a braid before she slew her 2 fingers to break free from fate. Before we conclude this video with a summary, let's speculate on something that's been plaguing the community's minds since the release of the story trailer. For a moment, let me tell you my story of Marika. In the story trailer, when Marika is removing the runic threads from what looks to be a yonic image, I believe that these are runes that would become the Elden Ring. And I believe she's pulling them from an eye of what we would call a vessel of the Abyssal Serpent. I suppose that Marika, in a kind of alliance with the Hornsent, worked to bring the Serpent God through the gate by activating the Yorishiro, the gate, with the godskin serpent body acting as the Yoramashi, or vessel for the Serpent God. I believe that Marika was supposed to attend to the Serpent God, but instead killed the god, betraying the era to be of the Hornsent and their serpent deity to come. After killing this vessel, Marika becomes pregnant with Messmer in her attempt to seal the great Serpent God away, later needing to place Marika's scar seal over Messmer's eye to protect him from the serpent within. My evidence is threefold, but loose. When we see Marika in the story trailer during this encounter, she's donned the serpent bracelets, the only time we see her wear them. This, combined with the fact that Marika's people are called Miko in Japanese, helps to give meaning to the serpent bracelet she's wearing in the trailer. According to Yu Soma Machine in a post linked in the description below, Miko means shamaness of a Shinto shrine that attends to the kami, or gods. It follows that we should take the serpent bracelets to signify that the kami which she was attending was a serpent god. Aside from this trailer and the opening cinematic, there are no other times where Marika is represented wearing serpent imagery. After all, in the Age of the Erdtree, it's blasphemous. Secondly, when we duplicate the picture of the being that Marika is pulling the threads from, rotate it 90 degrees to the left, and place the copies next to each other, a picture begins to emerge. This is a picture of a serpent god constructed of godskin, felled and laying on its side. Combine this with long-standing arguments and observations in the community about the relationship between the serpent god Igle and the godskin, and a fairly compelling narrative rears its head. We fight the godskin noble at the Temple of Igle. It's guarded by a black flame monk, and inside the temple are statues of bird-snake hybrids that are, like other things, converging, reminiscent of the connection between Igle and the Crucible. In short, I believe that the spirit of Igle was the living god of the tower when Marika used the Divine Gate to contact the Greater Will. There are these really unique, snake-skinned columns that seem out of place in Enir-Ilim, but also match the age of that era. I think that, upon being seduced by the Greater Will and her two fingers to plant the Erdtree and supplant the Great Tree, Marika learns of the Divine Gate at the top of Enir-Ilim. In order to reach the Divine Gate, she would need to become a Miko of the Serpent God, adorning serpent imagery and climbing the tower. She would have had the blessing of the Empyrean Grandam and the Hornsent. I originally wondered whether she was going to be sacrificed to the Serpent God, but such a sacrifice would not have made much sense in the context of the Hornsent calling her actions a betrayal and an abandonment. Marika then felled the Serpent God, and the strange result of her killing the god is her pregnancy with Messmer. The last speculation I'll offer before concluding about the nature of the Scadutree is this. After everything we've said here, it makes sense to assume that Miquella chose Mohg to play his role because of his already fated interactions with the Formless Mother. The Exaltation of Blood talisman reads, "Render up your offerings of blood to your lord. Drench my consort's chamber. Slake his cocoon's thirst. His awakening shall herald the dawn of our dynasty." In short, while blood sacrifice is still required for ascent into godhood, I believe that Miquella chose Mohg because Mohg is another side of the coin to Miquella. Mohg accepts all into his dynasty who are willing to serve, and those who serve Mohg and offer up their blood sacrifice do so willingly. Ironic, because near to how his mother removes death from the lands, Miquella intends to remove agency, and thusly morality. In conclusion, the Scadutree is the great tree of legend. Marika, in her quest for power to conquest, is seduced into bargaining with the Greater Will, allowing her and her newfound lineage to spread out across the lands between, subjugating peoples and gods alike. Marika cultivates the Erdtree and vows to protect it with the dynastic power offered to her by her two fingers. Ultimately, this pact between her and the Greater Will goes south, leading to the shattering of the Elden Ring and the Shattering War. When the Erdtree is grafted onto the roots of the Great Tree, it becomes starved for nutrients, unable to keep up its once perfect spiraling towards the heavens. In establishing the Age of the Erdtree, the Greater Will requires Marika to seal the Great Tree and those who worship it behind a great veil. It should not be known by those who would live in the era of grace that their eternal tree, which provides them blessings of sap, is a facade which requires the sacrifice of another, greater tree. The Scadutree is an inspiration for many of the technological wonders we find in the lands between, from the eternal cities to the old palace ruins. Perhaps even spirit springs find their roots here. Without its being a spiral which reached to the heavens, none of our adventures in the lands between would have taken place. The Scadutree is a faded symbol of a once normalized crucible current which is now outcast from the general social structure. The Scadutree is not in the shadow of the Erdtree, it is the shadow of the Erdtree, connected at the roots. And those who rest their eyes on it day in and day out in the Land of Shadow see it as a reminder of Marika's betrayal and abandonment, leaving them behind to suffer when she moves on to the lands between to become a god. In light of these new discoveries, it seems clear to me that, after Marika used the Divine Gate to bargain with the Greater Will and usher in the Age of the Erdtree, the Hornsent used the Jarring Ritual in Bonny Village in order to try to reinvigorate the Divine Gate with the malleable flesh of the shamans, calling those who would be placed on the gate saints. When Marika returns to the Land of Shadow to secret Messmer away because of his curse, likely at the behest of the Greater Will, given that Messmer is seen as a threat to the Erdtree because of his kindling, Marika realizes that the Hornsent have perpetrated this genocide on her people for her actions. So, she calls Messmer to wage endless war against them. Why should Marika get to ascend, and not the Hornsent, the people she likely formed an allegiance with in order to meet the demands of the Greater Will? Why should the Hornsent be veiled and abandoned by someone that they likely considered divine herself, and treated as an Empyrean? Perhaps this tale is one which sees Marika, the villain, after all. Next time you look up and see the Scadutree, what will you see? A downtrodden, bent, brittle, and spirit-broken tree whose sap is falling endlessly at its base? Or will you see a great tree, which acts as a spiral to the heavens, and an inspiration for Enir-Ilim, the city of the gods? Did I miss anything about the Scadutree? What do you think it is? Is it the great tree? As always, like and subscribe, it really helps the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.